Attention, there's only a month left until summer. And my friends at Manscaped are here to make sure your little Gotham is prim and proper for the season with the Performance Package 4.0. Join the 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for summer by going to manscaped.com and get 20% off plus free shipping with the code BATBOOK. Now riddle me this. What is in the Performance Package 4.0? Answer: the tools to keep you comfy for a night out in Gotham. The Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer maintains the front yard with a cutting-edge blade that helps reduce accidents while maintaining the front yard. And you know the saying, the shorter the grass, the taller the tree. If you have some extra weeds in your ears and nostrils, the Weed Whacker is a handy device to trim the ones not even Pamela Isley would pluck. And if your downstairs desert is too dry for the head of the demon, refresh with the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant. It'll bring your Lazarus Pit back to life. So stock your utility belt with the right grooming gadgets at manscaped.com and get 20% off plus free shipping with the code BATBOOK. That's BATBOOK, BATBOOK.
All it takes is one bad day.
You've eaten Gotham's wealth, its spirit, but your feast is nearly over.
This is not my home. It's an operating table. And I'm the surgeon.
Why aren't you laughing?
From this moment on, none of you are safe.
Welcome to the Batman Book Club, a podcast exploring the Dark Knight Library. I'm your host, Ryan Lauer. The Batman Book Club is a proud member of the Batman Podcast Network, hosted by Batman on Film. Just go to batmanonfilm.com, click on podcasts, and you'll find the Batman Podcast Network. That's a whole list of other Bat-related shows that also dive into other nerdy subjects we all love to frolic about in our free time. The Batman Book Club is also on Patreon. If you like what's going on with the show and you want to help support it and keep the generators running in the Wayne Manor study, just go to patreon.com/thebatmanbc. Now, thank you for listening to episode 106, The Batcave Companion. I know the last episode was called The Batcave Companion, but that was with one of the authors of the book, Michael Kronenberg. Tonight, I have the other author of that book. He is a podcaster of the Kronenberg Chronicles, and he is also a Batman aficionado, massive fan, super fan. He's even wearing a Batman shirt right now as I talk to him. It's Mr. Michael Kronenberg. Michael, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. You know, any chance I get to talk about Batman, especially Batman in the 70s, that Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams did, Marshall Rogers, Steve Englehart, all those guys, Irv Novick. I love it. So, you know, I can talk about them forever.
Forever. I mean, Batman I can talk about forever, and then even if we narrow it down to certain eras, just as long. I have a couple questions for you. For one, let's for those who maybe don't know, what's a brief summary of who are you and some of the work that you've done?
Well, I'm a graphic designer, and I am the graphic designer for the Film Noir Foundation. If anybody has seen Noir Alley on TCM, hosted by Eddie Muller, he is my boss. He is the president of the Film Noir Foundation and the founder of the Film Noir Foundation. So I design their programs for their festivals. I design their quarterly magazine. I design their books. I also work a lot for Tomorrow's Publishing, who published the Batcave Companion. The cover artist. I am the cover designer for Back Issue magazine, which is edited by Michael Kronenberg. And I've also designed and laid out a number of their books. I've written for Back Issue, and I've written for a couple of other magazines. There is a magazine that I designed with another Marvel artist called Rough Stuff, which was short-lived, which was about like the process of creating comic book art. And that's about it. I also publish a boxing magazine. I'm a big boxing fan, so I publish a boxing magazine called Ringside Seat.
So I told Michael this too, that I found Back Issue magazine that like maybe 2 months, 3 months of after the pandemic really kicked into gear, COVID really kicked into gear, and the Batman 1989 issue. That was actually how I found
that was a fun cover to do. That was one of the covers that, you know, I there are a number of covers that I get to do that, you know, I just say, Michael, I am going to just do this one the way I want and go nuts with it. And
let's get nuts.
Yeah, exactly. It's perfect, right? You know,
yeah,
from the movie. But he's great because he lets me kind of like have some creative freedom on some of these. I mean, not all of them, but on certain ones. And so they're a lot of fun to do. And that one in particular was a lot of fun. There's a really good one coming up.
Oh.
That I don't know if I can say anything.
Okay.
You know,
Sure.
see.
I wouldn't want to get you in trouble.
No,
would you just
I can't
say that
anything
I would
about
be
it.
very interested in it?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good enough. Okay. Before we dive into the Batcave Companion, your part in it, I have to ask you what I ask everybody the first time on the show: of what is your favorite Batman story?
Wow, that's hard.
Expected.
But I'd have to say, and I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's the one that had the biggest impact on me. Pretty close to being my favorite, and that's Batman 232. And that
perfect.
was that is the introduction of Ra's al Ghul, and the reason for that is because I saw that comic. I was about 7 or 8 years old. I saw that on the spinner rack at a 7-Eleven, and before that I had like bought comics as a kid. It was kind of throwaway entertainment for the most part. You know, I had watched the Batman TV show, you know, and reruns and stuff, and kind of liked it. But I saw Neal's art, I saw that cover, and it really took me. And I always had an artistic, even as a kid, I had an interest in art. My mother was a fashion illustrator, and my father was also had some interest in art. And I looked at Neal's art, and it kind of changed my life. I mean, if you can say a comic book or something changes your life, and everybody has that moment, that comic book and seeing Neal's art in it changed my life. And it made me not only want to become I wanted to become a comic book artist, but I wanted to be an artist. And it also, I became a comic book collector and a comic book interested in comic book art. And from that point on, I recognized, and I started seeing the name of a comic book writer, the name of a comic book artist. It's like I started recognizing styles. And of course, Batman, because I love that Batman. It was like the only Batman I really had to compare to was, you know, the Adam West Batman, who was kind of goofy. And even the Batman that came before Neal, you know, in the Silver Age, you know, who had Robin, but this Batman was dark. This Batman was serious. This Batman was kind of scary. And Neal's art and his ability to illustrate and render the grittiness and realism just blew me away. And then you've got the origin of Batman and Robin in that issue too. Which was, you know, a great thing to boot. And then you have the introduction of this really interesting and fascinating villain, you know, who has this tie to Batman and knows his secret identity.
Wow.
So I love that issue. I could name a ton of other issues too that are great, but that's the one that had the biggest impact on me.
That issue. So when you got it off that spinner rack, did you treat it like a kid would treat a book, or is that one in great shape at this point?
I had to rebuy it.
No.
I had to rebuy it. In fact, you know, it's funny, anytime I bought Neal's stuff, those comics were really well read. I mean, the covers were starting to fall off. They were tearing and fraying, because as a kid, I was just studying. I was studying every panel that he drew, and I was actually copying whole pages as a kid. You know, I was just copying an entire page. I would take an entire page and just copy it and draw it. So, Yeah, that stuff was well read. I don't think I got into the point of like taking care of my comic books. It was a while after that. I was still handling it like a kid, and they were well read.
So that reminds me of like the I don't know why it triggered me, but not taking care of. I had a stack of comics that I was given early '90s, and or no, this was pre the stack that I was given. So I had some just random comics, and one was Detective 612, which is a Norm Brayfogle cover of Catman and Catwoman kind of in silhouette, and Batman's laying down, he's scratched and everything. And I adored that cover. And my mom was a babysitter, and it was nap time, and the babysitting kids went and just tore it to shreds. And it broke my heart.
Yeah,
But then awesome. I got a new cover, or I got a new issue. I don't know why that started me asking if it's still in good shape. That's what triggers, like, I don't know, that's a painful memory, I guess, that pops up at random times. But okay, well, let's get started talking about the Batcave Companion. I'd like to hear your side of it, of how did your involvement in the book come about? What's the origin story?
Well, I had been working as the art director and graphic designer for Comic Book Marketplace magazine. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. But when that folded, I contacted John Morrow because John is also a designer and graphic designer, and I loved his magazines. And I said, hey, do you need any work? I'm looking for some freelance work. And I had noticed that they were doing companion books. They had done, Michael Urey specifically had done Justice League Companion, which I owned, and I owned his Superman Companion. I loved those books. I was like, man, I want to do a Batman Companion. I was like, I got to do a Batman Companion. So I actually wrote out a proposal to him. I mean, a long proposal of like all the things I would handle and all of the things I would write about, research, and the people I would interview. I had already interviewed Neal at that point, actually. My original, the interview I did with Neal at Continuity for those 2 days originally appeared in Comic Book Marketplace magazine. And I had the opportunity working for CBM to interview a lot of people. I interviewed Will Eisner, I interviewed Alex Ross, Bernie Wrightson. So that was one of the things I talked to John about in my proposal, that I would interview Denny O'Neil, and if I needed to go back to interview Neal again, I would interview Neal and Steve Englehart and so forth. And he wrote me back to say that Michael Urey had already started working on, I don't know how far Michael had gotten, but he had already proposed doing a Batman Companion. And Michael agreed to work with me, and it made sense that Michael, who's older than me, grew up with the Silver Age Batman, and that he would kind of handle that the book would be split in two, and that he would handle the Silver Age Batman in the 60s, and that because I grew up with the Batman in the 70s, that I would handle that. And and I had already interviewed Neal, and I had a friendship with him and his family, so that's kind of how that got started.
How did the discussion then go? Was it both of you basically agreeing as far as the point that you would start for the Bronze Age? For
yeah, I the thing that made sense was One Bullet Too Many, which is Batman. Geez, what is that? Batman 217, I think, or something like that. That's when Dick Grayson leaves for college, and Bruce Wayne and Alfred leave Wayne Manor to go to the penthouse above Wayne Foundation. So I think I started a few issues before that. There is an issue of Batman where, and this is actually logged in the index that I created, I think I started. I'm going to actually refer to this. No, I actually start with, yeah, it's Batman 217. So I actually started with it, with that. I think I did my research and looked into the letters pages before that at the hints that Julius Schwartz gave that he was going to change, that a big change was coming.
And he teased those, I think, didn't you say in your book, he teased those in Detective even?
In
of
Detective,
like it's coming.
Yeah,
change,
the
big change.
He called it the big change. And I think it's Batman. I think it's either Batman or Detective comic, like right before the issue, the month before One Bullet Too Many, that they show on the cover, this, it's a Nova cover, and it's like this very sensationalistic cover where like Batman and Robin are splitting up, and it's like, oh, what is this about? Why could this be? And it's really all it is at the end, Dick, Robin or Dick Grayson is hinting that he's going to be going off to school and he's going to be going off on his own. And then you got One Bullet Too Many, and that's kind of where that's the demarcation point really for the Bronze Age Batman.
It's a significant change, which I guess that would, if you know your history, which I mean you and Michael clearly do and did, it's like this is just very clear of this is where we begin for the Bronze Age.
Yeah, and and I think it was planned and discussed between Schwartz, Frank Robbins, and Denny O'Neil that this was this deliberate idea that they were going to get Batman back to his roots, back to 1939, that 1 year, which is, I love that 1 year where he's by himself, because he's very close to the pulp character. He's very close to the Shadow, who he's most closely based on. And just like Batman with the clothes on his back, he doesn't have the gadgets. They're going to get rid of the gadgets. And a lot of this came from the fans. There were fans who were writing in saying, they were really tired of the camp. They were really tired of the buffoonery, and even me as a kid growing up, once I got that Neal Adams issue of Batman and really got into that Batman who was the Batman. There's the movie The Batman. Well, at that time he deliberately, they put that article before his name. He was deliberately the Batman from that point on, and throughout the 70s. And so I really got into that. I love that. And the outside world still kind of attached the camp aspects to Batman, and that's how they looked at Batman. For me, it was like, as a kid, it was like I took this stuff seriously, and it bothered me, because it's like, well, this isn't what it is. Take a look at Neal Adams. Take a look at what Denny O'Neil is writing. Look at this stuff. So, that's one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book. And also I think people had forgotten that it was Neal Adams really who brought him back to being a creature of the night and brought him back to being this avenging hero, who was deeply affected by, the death of his parents. I think people, not to take anything away from Frank Miller, because I love Frank Miller, and I love Dark Knight Returns, and I loved Year One, and I love Daredevil. I'm a huge Frank Miller fan, but I think too many people say, oh, it was Frank Miller who darkened the character. He went from, the camp thing of Adam West to Frank Miller. And it's like, no, Neal Adams started. He started it in Brave and the Bold. And, I know you've read the book, and when I interviewed Neal and I talked to him about it, Neal is the one who really started it. And he started it in Brave and the Bold, the Bob Haney stories, and he did it very simply without even changing Bob Haney's scripts. He just made sure he rendered Batman at night and Batman in the shadows, and Neal's style of drawing was just so realistic and so it was so different from anything else out there. And I think so many fans took notice of it. Julius Schwartz at first did not want Neal drawing detective or Batman. He refused, and Neal, asked him over and over again, and he refused. And it was Murray Boltinoff, who was the editor of Brave and the Bold, who took Neal on. And the letters from fans coming in saying, where is this Batman? Why isn't this Batman in Detective Comics? Why isn't this Batman in Batman? And finally, Julius Schwartz had to give in. And I think that also was what kind of got them going, O'Neill, Schwartz, and Robbins, into like, okay, you know what? Let's take Batman. Look what Neal has done. Look, people love it. Let's take Batman back to the way he was back in 1939 by himself. Because comics in the 70s, there was more relativity going on, the real world, certainly Stan Lee was doing it at Marvel with Spider-Man, and Steve Englehart was doing it with the Avengers and Captain America. So I think those things, but Neal was initially the one who pushed it. So my one of the reasons I wanted to do the book was so that Neal would get the credit that I felt he deserved in changing the character.
We're on the subject of him, so I think let's continue talking about Neal Adams, because of course he's still in the public zeitgeist, if you will, right now, because he passed away recently. It's a good time to reflect on his work. In this book you have, which, as you said, this book was released in 2009. Your interview, which you put in the book too, was in 2003. Right. But I mean, he's talking about late 60s, early 70s, so it's not outdated. It's very relevant.
It's evergreen. It's evergreen material.
Exactly.
And I was very happy that I was the first person to ever really interview Neal just about his Batman stories. He had had many interviews. Neal has been interviewed many times, but Neal usually was interviewed over a broad subjects, and he did so many things besides Batman, of course. But I did that interview for me more than anybody else.
Sure.
I was obsessed with his Batman stories. Like I said, they kind of changed my life. And I asked him all the questions that I wanted to know. It wasn't even, it had nothing to do. It was like, oh, I think, people would want to know this kind of, it's like, no, I wanted to know this.
I want to know
this stuff I wanted to know.
I may not even publish this interview. I just need to know for myself here. Okay, Mr. Adams. How did that come about then? Can you take us through how you got that set up, your reaction and all that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I had a million questions for him. Being a big fan and being somebody who was an artist and studied his work, I had a ton of questions for him, and it reflects a long interview. So, I got all the answers, and Neal's great. Neal was great. They say don't meet your heroes because you'll end up being disappointed. That wasn't true with Neal.
Not true.
Fantastic. I mean, I spent 2 days with him, and he sat and at the time his studio continuity was incredible. It was state of the art. And he was sitting there finishing comps for advertisements that he was working on as he's talking to me. And his wife Marilyn would come over and it's like, Neal, get working, you have to finish this. And but he sat there and talked to me, and he was great, bought me lunch, and it was very relaxed, and he never hesitated. He answered every question, and he had the answers to everything. It wasn't one time I asked him something that he said, I don't know. It was a long time ago. I don't know. He had the answers.
It's surprising to me how you said that with so bringing his vision of Batman over to the Batman comics in Solo, because it's like he got noticed in a team up book. His work got noticed in a team up book, and so then it would be like, well, let's bring him over so he's just by himself with the Neal Adams. And you do include in the interview with him of the editors. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name. The Brave and the Bold editor. Yeah. How Julius Schwartz was very much like, no, get out of here. And Murray was like, yeah, okay. And to have at it. And I just like the story. And then because I've heard Neal Adams, listening to stuff on YouTube with him, and when he was on with Kevin Smith, it's like I could hear his voice, which is crazy because you were in the room with him interviewing him, but I could hear his voice answering the questions as I was reading it in your book. And that was just is a very good and fascinating read for me because of the information that he was handing out, which blows my mind too, that nobody had asked him specifically on his Batman run, because I feel like that would be something
I know
everybody asked him about, and maybe he was sick and tired of talking about, like, I've done more than just Batman. But
yeah, I don't he never came across to me as like, oh, I'm tired of talking about this. I mean, he was he had an answer for every question. He surprised me, which is great. I mean, in an interview, don't want to be bored.
yeah,
I think Neal's incredibly intelligent. Besides being an amazingly talented artist and storyteller, but he was incredibly intelligent. But he also, and this is known about Neal, is that he has opinions. He had very strong opinions. He told me he preferred Bob Haney's stories to Denny O'Neill's. He preferred working on, if you just recently read the interview, I mean, that struck me, because it's like, for me, taking nothing away from those Brave and the Bold stories, I love them, and I love Bob Haney's work. It's crazy at times. If you're familiar with the whole Brave and the Bold run, I mean, they're wild stories, and they're a lot of fun and very entertaining. But man, those Denny O'Neil Batman stories are just like, for me, what O'Neil and Adams did almost transcended, comic books. Those are great stories. Night of the Reaper, and the story about the freak show, the carnival, the carnival people. There's all kinds of stuff like that. So I was surprised that Neal said that. That said, I watched a YouTube video, a very quick YouTube video of Neal talking, and he was talking up how great Denny O'Neil was, and how great it was to be in a partner with Denny O'Neil. So, I think I caught him maybe at a point he was just like, oh, Bob Haney,
yeah.
No, he didn't denigrate Denny at all, and I interviewed Denny in the book.
Oh yeah, we'll get to him too.
But anyway, my point is that Neal was a great interview. And he answered everything, and he could surprise me at times too.
I wanted to comment on that part too, because I pulled out the Batman Illustrated Neal Adams collections, and I've been rereading through those, and I dove into his first Brave and the Bold story with Deadman, Track of the Hook,
right?
With that, and then the following story, and then I read some of the Batman 232 and stuff like that too, and I could see what I think he meant, in the sense of Bob Haney's scripts I felt were a little bit more like dense, but that's not like a negative. I just felt like there was maybe a lot more, whereas Denny's, to me, it moved faster, where Haney's was like, don't speed read through this, just sit, absorb.
Yeah, I think
read
also,
the elements, the different layers.
I think Haney's stuff is more entertaining. I think Denny, if you know Denny O'Neil, if you're familiar with his work and his writing, I think Denny was more serious, and he was trying to get across certain social aspects and psychological aspects. I mean, Denny could be very, very serious, and his stuff was very, very serious. The Green Lantern, Green Arrow stuff. And Bob Haney's work is not that he didn't have social elements into his comics. He did. Sometimes it came from somebody who was a bit older and was trying to understand what was going on with young people at that time, which is very entertaining and very interesting. But his stuff was more entertaining, and I think that's what Neal liked about it. It was like it was entertainment. You didn't have to think about it. It wasn't. He wasn't taking. I think maybe Neal thought Denny kind of took himself maybe not took himself too seriously, but maybe took the stories too seriously at times.
Gotcha.
And I like that. I mean, I like that aspect of Denny's stuff. I mean, I love those stories. You know, Neal even just was a little objectionable about the Joker, the way he killed. You know, that, you know, if you read in the interview, you know, it's like it took him back some. You know, I mean, this was something which was brilliant. I mean, you know, Denny, you know, brought him back to as far as the Joker, brought him back to the way he was in 1940. And that is the Joker that we see now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But for 30 years, the Joker was a clown. And that's all he was. So, you know, Neal was like a little put off by it, you know, he said. There was something else I think also that Neal said. Oh, he was a little put off by the first story, The Secret of the Waiting Graves, because that was a horror story. And it was like, he did a great job illustrating it, but he was a little put off by the fact that it was a horror story. It wasn't a detective story. And, you know, and Denny, when I talked to Denny about that story, you know, his whole idea was he wanted that first story that he did with Neal. I don't even know if he knew he was going to do it with Neal, but that first story of the new Batman, he wanted it very dark. He wanted Batman just with the clothes on his back and none of the supporting characters. He didn't want Commissioner Gordon in it. He didn't want Dick Grayson in it. He didn't want Alfred in it. You know, he wanted just Batman in it. I think it's a great story. I love it. Yeah, I mean, maybe Neal felt differently later on about it, but, you know, like he told me that he was like, I don't know if I would have gone in this direction. That's kind of what he told me.
Something that you included that he talked about in here, and I mean, I told you I didn't have any gotcha moments that I was going to ask you about specifics, but here's probably the most specific part of your part of the book is when he talks about the coloring.
Yeah.
And how at the time Marvel was allowed to use 64 colors and DC was only allowed to use 32. So there's something that's been hard for me just as a reader. I can't necessarily like binge read Golden Age or necessarily even Silver Age Batman stories. There's something with they blend of looking very similar to me. And there's almost, and I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it's almost like a little lack of energy in some of the pages. Then he breaks down the variety of colors. And I latched onto that right away because and how he which is great when I've been, you know, watching interviews and stuff of him of, you know, he just felt like, well, why? And nobody had a really good answer. So he just pushed why can't DC use just as many colors as Marvel? And he just by asking, and I think he put it as like, it took like 14 seconds or something like that. And then they got to double the color usage.
Right. Well, and that was Neal. He was an innovator.
Yeah.
He brought in all kinds of techniques because I was talking about this last night on my podcast when Tom King and I were talking about Neal and this from my years of reading Neal and talking to Neal was that, you know, he and Jim Steranko both, and I don't think you can talk about, the way I think about it, I don't think you can talk about Neal Adams in full without talking about Jim Steranko and vice versa, because they both had a similar impact on comics. Both of them had an incredible impact on comics. After Jack Kirby, they're the two most influential and important artists in comics. My opinion, I'm sure people disagree with me, but that's what I think. And so Neal and Jim both came from outside success to comics, and comics at that time, and granted, I think Jim was a little before Neal. Comics at that time were kind of a gutter publishing thing. You and it goes back to the days when, the Comics Code came in and there was, the sweeping changes, the Kefauver hearings that, obliterated EC Comics and stuff. And, and that's another whole story in itself. But it was almost an embarrassment to say you were a comic book artist. Be a comic strip artist, to be a syndicated comic strip artist, that was like considered the greatest thing as a commercial artist if you did that. And what you have to know about Neal is that he was a successful comic strip artist. He had the Ben Casey comic strip syndicated in hundreds of newspapers. And he was also a successful illustrator and did ads. And he came to comic books, and it's almost like slumming, it's like he came from this success, because he loved comics. He loved comic books, and he loved superhero comic books.
Do you think the comic strip popularity was because of the exposure?
Yeah, I mean, newspapers definitely, but the characters were more well known. I mean, comic books were just like, throwaway newspapers throwaway material, but comic books were just throwaway stuff. I mean, those characters just, they weren't, I think comic strips had a social angle to them too,
Okay. Yeah.
Al Cap and Walt Kelly, who did Pogo, they blended in some political stuff into their comic strips, and millions of people read it. Millions of people read it. Granted, comic books had a pretty high, a readership, especially compared to what they've got now back then, but nothing compared to comic strips. So like you said, newspapers, you're talking about millions of people. You're talking about every single newspaper, across the country that's has got these comic strips that are, and people would read it daily, every single day, and then they get Sundays, they get it in color. So Neal came from that, and he comes to comic books because he wanted to, because he was a fan and he wanted to. So, and the same thing with Jim Steranko. Jim came from being a very successful art director, and he was also a musician. Jim was also a successful magician and escape artist. I mean, Jim had a lot of things going on. And he also came back into comic books because he loved comic books and he loved superhero comic books. That's what he kind of grew up with. So Neal brought in a lot of the stuff that he did in commercial art. So the whole idea of the coloring and expanding coloring just made sense. He would pencil pages, so that a page was shot in halftone. The Two-Face story specifically, that splash page is penciled. And I talked to Neal about that, and that's not the only time he did that. He did that in other comic books and other stories. He would bring in pencils. He would grease pencils. He would bring photographic stuff in there. There's a church background in Joker's Five-Way Revenge in Batman 251, which is a photograph. So he did things like that, and Jim Steranko did he brought in a lot of innovative production techniques that had never been seen before.
I like that quote, as he said in there too, of, oh my gosh, and I just forgot it too, it was something along the lines of, well, the tools were there, they were just not being used.
Right.
So it's like he seemed like he was trying to be very modest in the sense of, I didn't create anything new. Don't give me too much credit here. It's just the tools weren't being used and I used them. I like that modesty and the matter of factness about that too. I don't know, there's something cool about reading about that.
Yeah, and he thought outside the box because he came from someplace else. He didn't come from comic books. A lot of the guys who were working, and I'm not going to put down any of those guys who were working, but they were just they were, it was their job. You know, I mean, what Neal wanted to do was he brought out this artistic sensibility, and not that there were other artists or, you know, writers or people, colorists who didn't want to bring artistic sensibility. But I think Neal and Jim, both coming from outside of the comic book world and wanting to be comic book artists, you know, I think there were a lot of comic book artists at that time, back in the 60s and the 50s, who were afraid to admit that they didn't want to admit that they worked in comic books, because that was looked down upon. And, you know, that was a way to make a living. And their approach was that was a way to make a living. You know, I have to give Stan Lee credit too. You know, I mean, the stuff that was going on at Marvel really changed things. You know, I think DC was kind of set in their ways a lot more. It was an older generation, and what Stan Lee was doing and the artists and the people that he was bringing in really revitalized comics.
Gotcha. Well, let's flip to his partner, if you will, then, of Denny O'Neil, who back in the March Madness time, it started to become an annual tradition now with the show on Twitter to do a bracket challenge here. And this year's was everybody voting in of who they think the greatest Batman writer of all time is. And Denny O'Neil came out on top. I was not that anybody, you know, whoever votes and they claim the winner, like, that's great, and all the names mentioned are respectable. But I would personally say, from a writing perspective, I don't know who's done more for the character of Batman than Denny O'Neil. Is that something maybe you'd agree with?
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think he reshaped the character, and as he said in the interview with me, he said, you know, what he and Neal did and what they were doing specifically in 1970 and 71, and how they presented the character, is kind of the way the character has been seen since. And, you know, when Chris Nolan did his movies, Denny and Neal both got very nice checks from Warner Brothers. And that, I think that was from Chris Nolan, because Chris Nolan pulled a lot from Denny and from Neal. He pulled a lot from other places too. He pulled a lot from Bill Finger, you know, and 1940, Batman in 1940, but he did pull a lot from what Denny and Neal did. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I think Denny started that platform. He created the platform that Batman stands on now. And again, that might be another reason why I wanted to do the book, because I think, not to take anything away from Frank Miller, because I love Miller.
Sure.
But I think he gets that credit. And it's like, even Frank would admit, I mean, Frank, you know, has said before that he owes his career to Neal, because he got his start by going to Neal and showing his portfolio to Neal, and Neal tearing apart his portfolio.
At Marvel first? Did that happen at Marvel?
No,
that was at DC.
First got to New York, he would just come and bring his portfolio and show it to Neal, whether it was at conventions or at continuity. I mean, Neal was great about young artists, but he would tear you a new one if he didn't like what he saw. And he always admired the fact that Frank kept coming back and getting better, getting better and getting better. So, but anyways, I want, Neal and Denny deserve the credit for the Batman that we know now, you know, and the millions of people who see the movie, the Batman, and they see Chris Nolan's movie, it's like, that's Denny and Neal's Batman. And if you want to even go further back than that, it's Bill Finger's Batman, you know, because they mined from that Batman in 1939, you know. I'll give Bob Kane a little bit of credit, just a little bit of credit, but I'll give mainly the credit to Bill Finger. So, you know, I should say Bill Finger, Neal Adams, and Denny O'Neil are who Batman is right now. I mean, that was created by those guys.
So what was so at this point it says that your interview with Denny was 2007. You'd already met your hero in Neal Adams. So what was it like then getting it set up when you found out that you were going to interview Denny O'Neil then?
Oh, it was great. It was exciting. And this wasn't an email interview. I talked to Denny over the phone. So a little intimidating, to be honest. Because I mean, it was very intimidating going into Neal too, but he made me feel so comfortable at the studio, and sitting with him and his family too, his kids and his wife, they were so great. So they really made me feel comfortable. But, it's like I had to call up Denny O'Neil. It's like, fuck, I got to call O'Neil. And I had, all my questions scripted out, but he couldn't have been nicer. He was fantastic. He gave me all the answers. I had things I wanted to know about the Joker comic book that he started. There was a Joker comic that actually came out. I was a kid when it came out, and of course I bought it because it's like Denny O'Neil.
Did it excite you when you knew that was coming out? Because it's it's
very
the Joker
exciting.
every issue.
Very exciting. But what disappointed me was like, wait a minute, is the Joker killing? He's supposed to kill people. What's going on here? I had to ask Denny about that. And if you read the interview and Denny talks about how difficult that book was to write and why he left it, because it really didn't make sense because DC had said he can't kill anybody in this, and he's always got to be captured at the end.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well,
which maybe could be fun for 4 issues, and then you'd be like, okay, I'm kind of sick of the formula.
Exactly. It got I don't know if you've read all those I don't know if you've read those comics.
I think I read the first issue and was like, because they collected, what was it? Maybe it was like, I don't know, 2010 or something. They did a trade paperback of them, which is now out of print. And yeah, I think I got my hands on one and read one. No, I'm good. I'm okay.
Yeah.
I don't need to read this.
I went ahead and read all the ones I read for this book. I read every Batman comic, every Batman, the title Batman from 1970 to 1979, every single one. And,
wow.
Because it's indexed. And then I read every detective comic from Secret of the Waiting Graves all the way to 79. But I also read the Joker, and believe me, after the second issue, it got tiresome already.
You were,
yeah. I mean, it was interesting as a curiosity after that, but the stories just once Denny left, the stories really got bad.
Just flipping through your index, which the same thing for other Michael's index too. The amount of comics to read. I mean, fun, but then also, wow, the amount of work.
Yeah, it was, but this was a labor of love for me.
Sure.
It really was, because I discovered all kinds of new things, reading those stories. As a comic book collector of age now, going from 70 to 79 goes for me from being a kid to being a kind of preteen. And there definitely was a period where I stopped reading comic books. I was more interested in other things. So I got to catch up on a lot of comic books I hadn't read. So it wasn't like I wasn't mining just old material. Some of it was new. And, some stories were bad. Some stuff was not good. And then there were some real gems out there that I reread. There was one story, and I called it out specifically in one chapter. And this was David V. Reed wrote this. And David V. Reed is an interesting person, because it was a big mystery of who, back in the day, who David V. Reed was. And I got that question answered because I asked Bob Rozakis, because I interviewed Bob Rozakis, who was Julia Schwartz's assistant. And he also was a writer. He wrote the Calculator stories. He created the Calculator character. And I said, well, what is the mystery? Who is David V. Reed? And David V. Reed was actually David Verne, who was originally a pulp writer. He wrote the pulps back in the 30s, and he was writing Batman stories under a pseudonym, David V. Reed. But anyways, this story by David V. Reed is a take on the Maltese Falcon, the 1941 film. And I'm a big film noir fan. As I was saying, I work for the Film Noir Foundation, and I was a film noir fan, way back, and rereading that story and seeing the parallels with the Maltese Falcon and Batman as the Humphrey Bogart character of Sam Spade, and how the femme fatale, the whole thing just he lifted it from the Maltese Falcon. And it's like, I don't know how many 10-year-old kids would have figured it out by then. At that time, I had that comic. I bought it off the stands. It didn't click with me. It clicked with me as an adult. And I love that story. And it ended up being, here's in the middle of nowhere, like 1976, I don't know, 77. It was kind of a period of where DC was kind of like flatlining a bit, but it's just one of these gems, that's just kind of in the middle of all that. So it was things like that reading all those comics, that was great. Just finding a gem like that.
So you say, okay, another random note. So you said that I don't know how many 10-year-olds, but that's so rewarding in this sense of, it takes me back to Space Jam in the 90s. Little 8 or 9-year-old me is watching it. The game is going on, the big game towards the end. And I forget which two characters, but it's like they shoot one of the bad guys, and then it cuts to them and they have smoking guns. They're in shades and dressed in black suits and a white undershirt. And the music does like a down. I just thought it was funny. Add 10 years, probably like 5-6 years, I see Pulp Fiction for the first time. And I have this massive aha moment of, oh my gosh, it's just like Space Jam, which Space Jam, that was their nod to Pulp Fiction. So yes, the young version of it, you may not get it, but then it's really fun as you grow older and expand, your horizons. Sure. And everything starts to click together then.
Yeah. And I wouldn't have read that comic if I hadn't been working on this book. It's just one story. It's not a story arc or anything like it. It's just one single story. And it wasn't until Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers came on, and Terry Austin. I always have to mention Terry. Came along, kind of like really revived Batman again. I mean, they really injected life back into the character. I think and injected life back into DC, to be honest with you, because DC was really going through a bad period.
As I was just saying with the connections part. So then what was your process is you make a lot of great like connections here of including the influence of pulp on Batman and the shadow on Batman, and then you have a chapter of horrors, inspiration to what Daniel Neal and Neal Adams were doing, or Neal Adams in general, because Moon of the Wolf and the drawing of someone that looks like Christopher Lee from the Hammer horror films and stuff.
And that was another thing that was fascinating for me, because I interviewed Mike Grell, who was the artist for that story. Now I saw that, and as a kid, I was a big classic. It wasn't classic at the time, but horror movies, and I loved Hammer movies. And going back, Neal talked about like Christopher Lee's Dracula was a big influence on the cape, cape that he drew. And look, Neal Adams, nobody had drawn Batman's cape like Neal Adams ever before, and it was like I'd have to say Marshall Rogers, then drawing, his cape also. And Marshall had his own way of doing it. But man, Neal's cape was that was amazing. But anyways, there's this vampire story, and I'm reading it as a kid. And as I said before, I had started noticing styles, noticing the art, and I'm reading, and I liked Mike Grell's work, a bit of a Neal disciple. It's like, man, this vampire looks like Christopher Lee, you know? And it was a great story. Elliot Magan wrote it. And it's a really fun story. And it's like, I always, even as a kid, because I loved horror movies, it's really cool having Batman. Why not? He's a creature of the night. Batman faced supernatural, you know, characters and supernatural stories. And I said, God, it looks like Christopher Lee. And I was like, I'm looking, it's like, he drew this. I can see the stills. I know the stills that he worked from, that Mike Grell worked from. So that was one of the things I had to do. It's like, I had to talk to Mike Grell and ask him about that. So, and he admitted, he said, yes, definitely. He said, I drew that. He said, I made it. He said, it looked more like Christopher Lee. And when I turned my pages in, Julia Schwartz said, this looks too much like Christopher Lee. You better change it. And so he had to change it. But the thing that was really fascinating about that story was that Mike Grell was not supposed to be the artist for that story. It's Bernie Wrightson. And Bernie Wrightson penciled out layouts for that entire story. And Mike told me that, this is in the book, that he worked from Bernie's layouts. So, I mean, it's a great work by Mike Grell, but boy, how cool would it have been to see a Bernie Wrightson Batman vampire story?
Imagine
in the 1970s, you know.
Imagine Grell taking on that assignment too.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
He said but it was intimidating, but I think from what he told me, he felt like he had to go ahead and work from Bernie's pages.
So, I mean, that one, it seems like you discovered it while reading a lot of these other connections. So the ones that I just mentioned, did you approach this project already having in mind the connection of Pulp and Batman and Shadow and Batman and stuff?
Yeah, definitely.
Gotcha.
You know, I had thought about that, you know, in years after, you know, thinking about specifically about that story arc about Ra's al Ghul that Denny and Neal did, where Batman fakes his death. You know, it's like, I saw the connections to Pulp. I saw the connections to Doc Savage, you know, and how, and, you know, and Denny, I can't remember in the interview if Denny admits that he was influenced by the people who assisted. You know, you had Batman having the alias of Matches Malone, and then you had Molly Post, who was the skier who helped, and then you had the Asian scientist who helped. So it was very similar to Doc Savage, the people that Doc Savage, who his aides who helped him.
Gotcha. You said, since you're a graphic designer, how much input did you have on the layouts of?
Oh man, that was important.
Okay.
Like I wasn't going to do this book unless I was able to design it. And the thing about doing that book is like, I found all of the art. I had to, at the time when I was doing this, there was only so much on the internet that you could use, that, especially anything that was high res. So I ended up having to contact, I got a lot of stuff of original art. I used original art. So I contacted art collectors who had this stuff, including sketches and I guess preliminaries of Neal's and other artists. And they were really great, and they were really nice to scan stuff for me and contribute. But you know, DC had to approve that book, and I sweated it out.
Yeah.
How, because DC had rules about how I was supposed to show things and how I was supposed to, the size of images and how I was supposed to depict things. They had very, very strict rules, and I sweated it out. But man, when they approved it, I was so happy when they finally approved it.
Did they approve as you went, or did you just present
the
the
final
finished
approval? They at the end. So it was really pretty, you know, it's like we had to kind of think about it. It's like, well, what if they don't approve this? And
yeah,
you know, I was even looking at it, I was like, I was thinking about the things that they might not approve, that I might have to replace, and what would I do and how would I do it? But in the end, they approved everything. I think we had to make one very minor correction, and that was it.
Do you remember perhaps the kind of the wildest rule to obey I know we're talking of a book that's over a decade old, but
I could show covers with the type for the type for the cover, the title, but it had to be a certain size. I couldn't show it large. I had to cut off, for some reason I had to cut off the title, like Detective Comics or Batman. And it's like, I don't know if that was a trademark or a copyright thing. I don't know why, but that was a specific rule. So I don't think you see any large images.
No, even that, I mean, the first chapter of this Bronze Age of the, Batman 217, it is as if it's a zoomed in portion of that cover. So we don't see which book or number or anything like that on it. That's interesting.
That was one of the rules. And you know what? That's fine, because that opening chapter is much better zooming in on characters as opposed to, showing the whole issue number. But
wow. Yeah,
that was one thing I remembered. I can't remember some of the other ones, but there were like it was a strict set of rules that they sent in. This was the last book that, DC, I don't think Marvel ever had an agreement to allow Tomorrows to do like these types of companion books. But DC did have an agreement, and it was, they gave Tomorrows, knowing they were an independent publisher, a very nice, the fee was inexpensive. They recognized the fact that they were an independent publisher, and so this was the last book, unfortunately, that they gave that cut rate, because after that it was going to be, the only people could afford that were the big publishers.
Yeah.
So this was it. This was the end.
That's too bad. I feel like it's a marketing, it's a book of marketing, of read more, Batman comics, basically. Because even reading this and some issues that I didn't know, that, the end is it spoiled, quote unquote. It didn't keep me from, I haven't read that one. Track it down in one of the books I have, or DC Universe now, or digitally somehow, and find it. It just creates more interest to, let me see this. It's fresh in my mind now. I need to read it.
I think the properties became so valuable. I mean, this book came out. This book actually was delayed. We had to delay it for when The Dark Knight came out, because we were working on it. We were about to release it, and The Dark Knight was about to come out, and DC asked us to put it on pause until after The Dark Knight was out, because they had some Batman historic books that were coming out. And so we released it after The Dark Knight. Wow. But, they're, with the movies and the success of the movies, both Marvel and DC, and the millions of dollars, and the fact that, you've got now Disney that owns Marvel, you've got Warner that is ever expanding, owns Batman and owns the DC characters. These properties are so valuable to them that they're not going to let anybody else do something like this. So you're never going to see another, at least from Tomorrow's, another concentration on a DC character like this. And it's too bad, because I mean, we wanted to do a second book, and it would have been great.
Yeah. So before we recorded, you'd mentioned that you want about working on another one on Legends of the Dark Knight, which you and I were both just gushing about before we hit record on what a great title. And I would love a history of that series book, something like that. That would be great.
Yeah, I think that's a book. I think that's a title that doesn't get enough talk, especially those first 100 issues, which were amazing.
We've covered, let's see, on this is episode 106. Prey and Venom are the only Legends of the Dark Knight stories that I've covered that anybody has chosen, and I'm really surprised by it. I'm going to take it over, and I'm going to choose a book myself, and it's going to be that Darker Than Death story, because somebody needs to read it. More people need to read it.
That is a great. That's a great later arc for the series.
I would love to now pick your brain on another. I mean, you could say iconic, legendary. Use your choice on the adjective team for the retroactively called Strange Apparitions of Steve Englehart, Marshall Rogers, and Terry Austin. Was that also a run that you were in on from the ground, like from release?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I think I titled it the definitive Batman ? Because I think a lot of people think about it as the definitive Batman. And I think, arguably it kind of is. It's amazing. I was a big fan of Steve Englehart's before, I was a big Marvel fan. And I loved his run on Captain America and the Avengers. So when I heard that he was coming to do Batman, I was really excited. And, I was a teenager at the time. And DC was going through a really bad time. I thought the books weren't good, especially Batman was in Detective Comics. The art I thought was kind of stale, the writing was stale. And he comes along and and Walt Simonson was the first artist who was supposed to do it. And Walt's an amazing artist. I have a commissioned piece from 1980 over on my other wall that Walt did when I met him at a convention.
You have a gallery in your room of all the great artists.
And then behind me is a poster of Dirty Harry. And in the book I compare that first Dirty Harry movie to the Bronze Age Batman. That was something that I strongly believe in. When I first saw Dirty Harry for the first time, it's like I immediately thought, man, they need to make Batman movies like this. But anyways, as far as Englehart stuff goes, he first started out with Walt Simonson, and then, eventually, Marshall and Terry Austin started working on it because they had been working on the backstory, the Calculator, which Bob Rozakis had created, and those were the backstories behind the main Batman story in Detective. And what's funny was like I'm looking as a kid, I'm looking at Marshall's work. And I'm going, God, this stuff's better. These stories are drawn better than the stories. I like them better than the Batman stories. I'm not talking about the story, how they're written necessarily. The Calculator is a pretty silly character, but the art is just great. It's like, man, I wasn't the only one. I mean, people were gushing over Marshall Rogers' work. And what's interesting as far as Neal goes with Marshall Rogers was that Neal and Terry Austin both worked at Continuity Studios. Neal, opened up the studio and had a lot of young guys working there. And Marshall and Terry were two of them. And there is one of the backstories, which is a Hawkman story, that Batman appears in. When I saw it as a kid and looked at it, I was like, damn, if this Marshall Rogers doesn't draw like Neal Adams, look at this. This is amazing. You'd think Neal Adams drew this. That was me as a teenager. When I talked to Terry Austin, Terry told me that specific story, they had been working on that story. Marshall was penciling it, and then Terry was going to ink it, but Marshall's pencil pages were sitting on his desk. He left for the day. And he and Terry both left for the day. Neal goes over to his drawing board, to Marshall Rogers' drawing boards, and looks at it and decides he's going to ink these panels, specific panels. And that's why they look like Neal Adams drew them, because Neal inked those pages. Anyways, it's just a funny little Neal Adams, Marshall Rogers story aside. The biggest regret about the Batcave Companion has to do with Marshall Rogers, who was a favorite of mine. He really got me back interested in comics again. When I knew Steve Englehart was going to do Batman and he was going to write it, I immediately said, "Oh, I got to start getting Detective Comics again." And then after those first two issues that Walt Simonson did the layouts for, and then when I heard Marshall was going to do it, because Marshall had already done a Calculator main story in Detective, I was like, oh, I'm all right. This is fantastic. Marshall Rogers and Steve Englehart together.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really excited about it. Marshall was great. And I actually became friends with Marshall in Silver Spring, Maryland. I met him at a convention, and we kind of just hit it off. And we had a couple of lunches together. But anyways, my biggest regret is that Marshall died before I could interview him.
Ugh.
He had a heart attack. And I mean, it was like that. He had a heart attack and died. He wasn't in the hospital or anything. He just died right away from a heart attack. He was a chain smoker. But that said, it was unfortunate. But Terry Austin, I was able to get in touch with Terry Austin, and Terry was just opened up to me about so many things that I had no idea about. I don't know if anybody really knew about some of the stuff that was going on at the DC offices. Joe Orlando wanted to fire them, and Joe Orlando's a legend. So, but Joe Orlando couldn't stand their work and couldn't stand their art. And how Vince Colletta, who was the art director and vilified by many people as an inker, was kind of their savior at DC. But they had huge fans, and the letters that kept coming in about their work, people loved it, and people loved their work. But what I got from Terry was some real true honesty about being a comic book artist and working in the industry in the 70s, and how hard it was, and some of the problems that Marshall had, and the fact that Terry didn't get enough credit for the stuff that he did. That Marshall, a lot of times Terry was doing almost all of the art. Marshall, couldn't finish stories. Marshall was having some substance abuse problems, and Terry was doing the finishes. And I wrote about that. He told me about that, how he had. He just wasn't getting enough money for what he was doing, for all the work that he was doing. And, he kind of resented that.
Yeah.
And when you really look at that art, and you really look at Terry's inking, it's great. I mean, he did fantastic work. Terry is definitely one of my favorite inkers of all time. The stuff he did with John Byrne and for X-Men was great too. They were a great team also.
I think go ahead.
But that said, that run is amazing. I mean, I hold that run up against anything, and I honestly, arguably, maybe it is the definitive Batman.
I think what fascinates me with that, so I already told you that, so we did an episode, it was episode 50 last year. Some friends came on and we did a top 10 favorite Batman stories. Darker Than Death was one of them for me. Batman Prey was on there, and then Strange Apparitions is on there for me as well. It fascinates me, just before even knowing any of the behind the scenes stuff, that so much was done on the history of Batman in 6 issues. And it's not even like every story was now 22, 23 pages. I think some were even shorter than that. And the impact of that run had, I don't know if anybody's had a bigger impact on the character with in a smaller amount of time. So I know that rightfully so, Dark Knight Returns is credited as it's brought such a punch to the character, but it's like, those are 4 books that are not your standard comic book size. This was 6 regular comic book page issues. And I mean, the Dark Knight, we could see the influences of that run. And the Batman, I think you could pull some as well. And
there's no doubt. Yeah, there's no doubt. All of the movies pulled from them. In fact, as far as I know, I interviewed Steve Englehart for the book also, and he told me that
the 89 movie,
I think the Burton's Batman, he did a script treatment for that, and they didn't use it. But in the end, Vicky Vale is really Silver St. Cloud.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't, I mean, you could definitely see, because there's a book I also read. It was 100 Things Batman fans should know and do before they die. And there was an interview with Steve Englehart there, and I think he said something similar. And when you think about it that way, of okay, pretend that Vicky's name is Silver St. Cloud. Okay, I think that a lot of that works. Imagine Carl
Yeah, I mean,
Grissom
I
is
think,
Rupert Thorne. Yep,
yeah,
a lot of that works. So like
absolutely.
Jack Nicholson's Joker is, you visually see him as Marshall Rogers' Joker. It's like, interesting.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Steve Englehart was a great writer. I don't think people, when you told me that that people recognize, Denny as the number one writer ever, not that I would question that, but I put Steve Englehart pretty damn close.
Mm-hmm.
That run, he fits so much, as you were talking about, he fits so much into that run. And I cannot tell you the excitement of when it was coming out. And there were at that time, there were no comic shops. You had to go to a newsstand. I'd go to a newsstand and pick it up. And the excitement of every issue when it would come out, because he did a real true kind of Marvel, that was like a Marvel treatment of Batman. That was the kind of stuff that you saw Marvel do with their characters, that Englehart did with Captain America, that Stan Lee and Jerry Conway were doing with Spider-Man. Steve Englehart did that with Batman. He got it personal. There was a lot of personal stuff in there. I mean, he had a romance with Silver St. Cloud. His identity was revealed. There's a politician who wants to wipe him out. I mean, he had to face all of these things as a vigilante, because it's like Batman was considered a partner with the police. He was the guardian of Gotham City, and in Englehart's run, he is a vigilante. He's an unlawful vigilante. And then add to all that, the great work that Marshall and Terry did. It's incredible. The thing about Denny and Neal stuff was, other than the Ra's al Ghul saga, that Neal didn't even draw all those issues. Irv Novick drew some of those issues, and I love Irv Novick's work. But Denny and Neal's stuff was scattered. Even there was a couple of issues before them, and most of them, aside from the Ra's al Ghul stuff, were single stories. The continuity wasn't there. There wasn't this continuity. It's like, oh, what happened here in this previous story is continuing into this story. That was something that DC never did. DC was really concentrated on single arc stories that were like just in one issue, and that was it. It was rare that you got these multi-part stories. And what Steve Englehart did was, Marvel did it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Marvel universe that Stan Lee created was a true thing. I mean, all the characters related to one another. There was a true universe there. DC didn't have that necessarily. I mean, they had team up books, but you didn't really have that. But Englehart brought that sensibility, and I think that's what I love so much about it. And like I said, you had these two young, great artists, in Terry Austin and Marshall Rogers, working on it. It is arguably the best Batman story arc ever.
I think so. Just the story that we read, yes, I think adds even more triumph to it. Is the behind the scenes part when, and please correct me if I'm wrong, something of Englehart turned in the scripts and then went overseas.
Yes, to write a novel. He was leaving comics. That was his kind of swan song for comics. He was going to go write novels.
So that's happening. And then back here, Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin are just they're getting it from Joe Orlando.
Right.
And didn't like their work or anything. So Englehart's unaware that's happening. Rogers and Austin, you can only imagine, they feel maybe their days are numbered. And then what ends up happening? The fans adore it, adore their work, adore what's happening. give us more. I mean, what a great, like, that in itself is a great story.
Right. It's a fantastic story. And I wanted to make sure that I got that across in the chapter. Because I didn't know about a lot of it. I mean, I knew about the adoration that they had from fans because I read it in the letters columns, but that was back in the day where the creators didn't have that connection to the audience the way they do now. Be it social media now, be it comic book conventions and the interaction there. You just didn't have it. You didn't even have like creators working together. I mean, Denny and Neal never worked together. I mean, Denny told me he never knew if Neal was going to do something or was going to draw that issue. He was never
Surprise.
He would just write a script, and he hoped Neal would do it. He would hope, but what was Neal's availability? And then also Neal was also notoriously slow with stuff, So, he just didn't know what his availability was. So he had no idea after he turned in a script who was going to do it. He couldn't say, "Oh, I want Neal Adams to draw this." That wasn't going to work. And when Englehart left, he had no idea who he turned in a script. He had no idea who was going to do it. So yeah, that fight that they went through was something else, and the screaming and yelling that was going on, and the fact that they persisted. And I don't know how familiar you are with Vinnie Colletta, the inker. Vince Colletta was the art director at the time of DC, and he gets a bad rap, because people always look at his inking jobs as hack jobs, because they look bad. They look like they've been rushed. But in his defense, they would always give Colletta, when an artist would turn something in really late and they had to get it turned around overnight, a story overnight, they'd give it to Vinnie Colletta and he would ink it. And he had only so much time to go ahead and do it. I don't know if he was the greatest inker in the world, to be honest with you, but to some of his defense, he had a reason it looked rushed. But on top of it, he was the art director, and he was the biggest defender of Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin. And the reason that they were able to stay on the book was because of him. There's a book, I think it's either come out or it's coming out from tomorrow's. It's about Vinnie Colletta because he had mob ties. So he's pretty fascinating guy.
Another good story. Here we go.
Yeah, I don't know that much about that. I just know in general he had mob ties. So I'm going to be interested in reading that book. But it wouldn't have happened. At least Rogers and Austin wouldn't have been doing it if it wasn't for Vinnie Colletta.
Wow. Excellent. I want to respect your time. So as we start to wrap up, I have a couple of questions. Couple questions for you. You can elaborate if you want, or don't at all, and that's fine. Just think, I want to pick your brain a little bit. So, in your opinion, what had a bigger impact, the new look or the big change? So, Detective Comics 327 or Batman 217?
They were both huge, but I wasn't around reading, Batman 327 and see it. All I know is the history of it. I can only speak for what I saw when I saw that Batman 232, when I saw what Batman had become, because I thought of Batman, as I said before, I thought of Batman Adam West. So did many people. So did most people. And it's like, this is Batman, what Neal Adams did. So to me, the biggest impact is what Denny and Neal did.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because in the other thing is like, that is who the character is now. As Denny said, who the character is right now is what Denny and Neal kind of got started.
Gotcha. Okay. No wrong answer. Wayne Manor or Wayne Penthouse?
I'm I'm partial to the Penthouse. I love Wayne Manor and I love the Batcave, but goddamn, I love the Penthouse, and I love Batman kind of like having to just work with his wits and his guile. Like I said, I love the Batman in 1939 before he had all of those things, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, that's not to say anything bad about Wayne Manor and the Batcave, because I love
wrong answer.
They're important, but it just comes again from, you know, that what got me started and what influenced me.
I know that maybe you showed your hand already to this, but we'll see which issue, another more impact, had a larger impact, do you think? Batman 232 or Batman 251? Joker's Five-Way Revenge.
Batman 251.
I think 251.
I mean, I think I dedicated an entire chapter to that, you know, and how and what they did. And I mean, even Neal, when I asked him, because that's the one story that Neal penciled and inked of Batman. And I asked, one of the questions, like I had to know, is like, why did you do that? And he said, because I knew it was going to be special.
Nice.
And I wanted to do it all.
Arguably the greatest Joker story ever told. I don't think that it is a top 5 greatest Batman comic cover of all time. I don't think anybody would debate that. Instinct was right. It was something special.
I agree with you on that. And I think for me, when I think of Batman and the Joker, it's the first thing I think of, you know. I mean, the Killing Joke is brilliant also. But I think the first thing I think of is Batman's Five-Way Revenge. Or I mean, Joker's Five-Way Revenge.
Yeah, give us the sequel, Batman's Five-Way Revenge.
Yeah.
Maybe the toughest.
You know, the interesting thing, just to digress, the interesting thing is that it was Denny who kind of got that whole opposite, like the Batman can't exist without the Joker and vice versa. That was first in that comic, you know, because the Joker is about to kill Batman, you know, and it's like, I don't want to kill him. It's going to ruin everything. Why should I? Because he's standing over him. He's about to put his foot on his throat, and he's going to kill him. Why would I kill him? You know, it's like, what fun is life without him? You know, and you saw that in The Dark Knight.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, all the way, you know, I think definitely, you know, Chris Nolan pulled from that story for that whole thing. And The Killing Joke is kind of all about that too. It's like they're each other's opposite number, and they can't exist without one another. It's
such a thing that recent comic, like someone new to comic book reading, and that could be, you know, the past couple years, 10 years, whatever, could almost be taken for granted. And it's like, no, try to get this context of at the time that didn't exist. And then Joker's Five-Way Revenge brought that to the forefront. And you don't get something like that just clicks, because at that point, I mean, Batman's 30 some odd years in existence, Joker too. And they stumbled across an idea that just worked. I mean, that was brilliant.
Exactly. And that was Denny. And that was Denny who came up with that, who had that idea. And it's like, you know, they took it from there, and it's still going on. That whole idea, you know, is still going on, and it started there.
Yeah. Toughest one yet. O'Neill and Adams or Englehart and Rogers?
Yeah, that's hard. That's very hard, but because again, the impact that Neal and Denny had on me as a kid, I'll go with them, because I wouldn't be into comic books if it wasn't for that comic book I picked up.
Gotcha. I'm glad I'm asking and not answering these. Let's see. And lastly, are you pretty?
I feel like I have to answer them. So it's like, I'm not going to give some wimpy, like, oh, it could be a tie. I'm trying to give you some.
I appreciate it. Yes, I know this is tough. Only us. I mean, us nerds only understand how tough these questions really are, because I don't know. You know, I'll answer. Of those two, I would probably go barely O'Neill and Adams over Englehart and Rogers.
It's a very tough call.
And maybe because of Joker's Five-Way Revenge helps give it just the edge. But obviously I love Englehart and Rogers too. Like, are you very familiar with Batman the Animated Series?
Yes.
Okay,
Love it.
perfect. Your favorite Batman the Animated Series episode that's inspired by a Bronze Age story. So you've got the Laughing Fish,
Yeah,
the
Laughing
Demon's
Fish.
Quest, Sideshow,
That's
um,
tough.
the Strange Secret of Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, which I was kind of disappointed in. It was like I was hoping that when the Hugo Strange is a favorite of mine. I told you before we started the broadcast, and that's because of what Englehart, Rogers, and Austin did. It made me want to go back and read all those Hugo Strange stories from 1940, 39, 40, and 41. That's tough. Demon's Quest was great. That was a two-parter.
They
And then
basically
there's
they
the,
kind
and
of
then there's the
covered
Moon of the Wolf. They did
Moon of the Wolf.
They
Yes,
did the Len Wein story. That was Neal's last Batman story. In the 70s. I'd have to say the Laughing Fish.
Laughing Fish, a favorite episode of mine as well. I think I liked the Demon's Quest. They kind of covered the whole Al Ghul, Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams in that two-parter. I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even to the shirtless duel at the end.
The duel, you sure? Yeah. I loved how Neal got into the whole thing about Batman's nipples with me.
Yeah.
In the interview. How shocked everybody was. Like, oh my God, Batman has nipples.
Reading his response in the book too just made it seem like so matter of fact too. Like, well, yeah, everybody has nipples. What's the big deal?
It was a shocking cover.
He did it first. Neal Adams did it first.
It was a shocking cover when you saw it when I was a kid. I mean, it was great. I mean, Batman had hair on his chest. It was like, what?
Yeah. That's great. So lastly, I try to do a poll question related to every episode. And so I was really trying to think some specifics that I hadn't already asked you that I could use for the poll question. So I think it's on the Batman Book Club Twitters at the Batman BC. The poll question is, which decade produced more memorable Batman comics? 1970s or 1980s? This is a poll for everybody, but yeah, by all means, feel free to if you think that you have an answer.
I'm thinking about that.
And I mean, I'm weighing in on this because I also vote in these polls, even though I come up with a question.
Yeah. Stuff in the 80s was really important. I mean, the stuff in the 80s were really impactful. There's a lot of stuff in the 70s that's not that great. You had Denny and Neal's stuff in the 70s, and then and Steve and Marshall and Terry's stuff in the 70s. And then, of course, we didn't get to talk about Archie Goodwin's one year.
Oh yeah, that's a great chapter too,
which is incredible, and he does not get enough credit for what he did. And it's a shame he only lasted 1 year. And amazing that Julius Schwartz gave up editorship of that book for 1 year to Archie. Archie Goodwin's one of the, he became the editor of Legends of the Dark Knight too. After Andy Helfer left, it was Archie Goodwin became the editor. And Marshall told me he came back to do Batman again because of Archie Goodwin in Legends of the Dark Knight when he did his arc. That's a really tough question. That might be the toughest one you've asked.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I would give the edge to the 70s because I feel like it was more spread out. Whereas, I mean, someone like you, who's kind of a Batman historian, you could rapid fire early 80s Batman stories, but I don't think like a lot of people could. They would focus on Dark Knight Returns year one, Death in the Family, Killing Joke, which was the latter half of the 80s. So the latter half's very strong and impactful, but I almost feel like the 70s, because of these two teams, spread out that decade.
Yeah, I think the art for me, when it comes to the art, I think the art in the 70s gets the edge, no doubt.
Yeah.
I think Miller is a great writer, and I think Year One and Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore is a great writer. I think their stories, and Brian Boland is a fantastic artist.
Yeah.
I mean, it took him 2 years to draw The Killing Joke. But it's really hard. That's really the toughest one. I mean, if I go back to the reasons for my other answers, which was, you know, the 70s, I'd have to, I guess I'd say the 70s has the edge, but very hard because there's some really important, impactful stuff happened in the 80s.
Yep.
That helped shape comics now, and helped shape the people who are creating comics now.
Wow. Yeah.
Because
well, no more questions.
I know Tom. I know my buddy Tom is you know, he loved Miller's. You know, I mean, Dark Knight Returns is very important to him, and a lot of the writers and artists now. I mean, they look at Dark Knight Returns as like the most important book in their lives. You know, it's right up there with Watchmen. You know, as in importance.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I saved that one as the poll question at the end. I don't want to drain you with any more tough ones. So this has been a treat, a real joy to sit and talk to you for, I said an hour. I think that's always a lie. I always go over because it's Batman, but appreciate you taking the time. I can talk about
Batman for 3 hours.
You keep going? Okay, this is half. You want to keep? No, okay.
No, if you want it, if you got more questions, I'm game.
Well, definitely you and I, if you're fine with it, let's stay in touch and let's bring you back on and talk some more Batman for sure.
Sure, I'd love to.
If you would like, where can people follow you? Plug away with anything and everything that you'd like.
You can follow me on Twitter at MW Kronenberg. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. As I said, the Film Noir Foundation is who I do a lot of design work for. Tomorrow's also. I've got my own boxing magazine, Ringside Seat. So you can usually find me retweeting stuff that has to do with the Film Noir Foundation and Tomorrow's and boxing magazine. I do a lot of stuff. I do packaging for Blu-ray movies and DVDs.
Oh, cool.
And stuff also. And I also have a podcast that I do with my son, which is about kind of anything and everything, called the Kronenberg Chronicles. So that's available on Apple if anybody's interested.
Awesome. Definitely track that down, because as you've mentioned, as of this recording, you have recorded an episode with Tom King.
Yeah,
we talking about Neal Adams.
Yeah, we did 2 episodes with Tom. We did one just a general talk, and then about the stuff that he's working on, and then we did one about George Perez and Neal Adams.
George Perez, yeah. So look and subscribe to that, the Kronenberg Chronicles. As for me, you can follow the Batman Book Club on Twitter and Instagram at thebatmanbc for latest episodes and upcoming episodes, and sometimes some giveaways. You can subscribe to the Batman Book Club YouTube channel. If you have anything you want to write in about, you can do that. Email thebatmanbc@gmail.com. You can help support the show in a variety of ways. Patreon.com/thebatmanbc. Go to TeePublic. There's some merchandise if you want to help the show out that way. Manscaped, our sponsor, manscaped.com. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code BATBOOK. But the best way you can help, if you don't want to spend any money at all, it's 100% A-okay, is rate and review the show. Whatever service you use to listen to podcasts, just give a nice review. The more reviews it gets, the more it helps spread the word. And as we all know, the word is panic. So for Michael Kronenberg, I am Ryan Lauer. Until next time, read more Batman comics.